23,000 feet above the jungle, a single Japanese fighter pilot spots a formation of American Grumman Wildcats climbing hard through the morning cloud. He is flying a Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific. His name is Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. He is 23 years old. He does not radio for support. He does not wait for his wingmen. He rolls the Zero onto its side and dives, alone, directly into the formation of 8 American fighters. In the next 4 minutes, he will shoot down 3 of them. Not one of the Americans will land a single bullet on his aircraft. By the time this war is over, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa will be credited with at least 64 confirmed aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring Japanese ace of World War II and one of the deadliest fighter pilots in all of human history. He will not survive the war, and the way he dies, that is the part no one tells you. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa was born on January 27, 1920, in the mountain prefecture of Nagano, far from the sea, far from any aircraft, far from any indication of what he would become. He was, by most accounts, a strange young man, quiet, brooding. He had a frail constitution and suffered from malaria so frequently during the war that his commanders sometimes grounded him against his will. He was not a physically imposing figure. He was pale, thin. His fellow pilots noted that he rarely laughed and almost never spoke about his victories. But in the air, he was something else entirely. Nishizawa joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1936 at age 16 and completed his flight training by 1939. From the very beginning, his instructors noted something unusual about him. He did not just learn to fly, he seemed to think in 3 dimensions in a way that most pilots never achieved. His aerial gunnery scores were exceptional. His low-altitude aerobatics were described by senior instructors as terrifying to watch. He was assigned to the Tainan Air Group, one of the Imperial Navy's most elite fighter units. By the time Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Nishizawa was already a veteran pilot with hundreds of flight hours in the Zero. To understand Nishizawa, you must first understand his aircraft, because in 1941 and early 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was genuinely the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. It had a maximum speed of 346 miles per hour. It could climb to 20,000 feet in just 7 minutes and 20 seconds. Its range was extraordinary, over 1,600 miles, which meant it could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory than any Allied fighter of the era. And it was almost supernaturally maneuverable. In a turning dogfight at low speed, nothing the Allies had could match it. American pilots who first encountered the Zero in 1941 and early 1942 were shocked. Nothing in their training had prepared them for an enemy aircraft that could turn inside them and reverse on their tail before they had time to react. But the Zero had a fatal flaw, one that Nishizawa could minimize through skill but could never eliminate entirely. To achieve its extraordinary performance, its designers had stripped out almost all armor plating and removed self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft weighed almost nothing. That was its power, but it also meant that a single well-placed burst of machine gun fire from an Allied aircraft could turn a Zero into a fireball in seconds. Nishizawa's entire career was defined by this contradiction. He flew the perfect predator in an aircraft that could not survive being prey. Nishizawa's combat career ignited over the Philippines in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. His first confirmed aerial victory came quickly, and then more followed, each one adding to a reputation that was beginning to spread through both Japanese and American aviation circles. By early 1942, he had been transferred to Rabaul, Japan's major forward base on the island of New Britain, and the Tainan Air Group began flying long-range escort and combat air patrol missions over the Coral Sea and the Solomon Islands. It was here, in the skies over Guadalcanal and Rabaul, that Nishizawa became something beyond a pilot. He became a legend. In Rabaul in 1942, 3 pilots from the Tainan Air Group stood above all others: Nishizawa, Saburo Sakai, who would finish the war with 64 victories of his own and survive to write a celebrated memoir, and Toshio Ota, a quiet, gifted pilot who would be killed in October 1942. These 3 men flew together repeatedly over Guadalcanal, and American pilots who survived encounters with them reported something that no training could have prepared them for. These were not just skilled opponents, they were hunters. Saburo Sakai, in his post-war memoir, described flying on Nishizawa's wing and watching him perform aerial maneuvers that Sakai, himself one of the finest pilots in the world, could not replicate. Nishizawa flew as if the Zero was an extension of his own body, Sakai wrote. I have never seen anything like it. On August 7, 1942, the United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal. The battle for the island, one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War, had begun. For the Japanese pilots at Rabaul, this meant flying 560 miles south to Guadalcanal, engaging in combat and flying 560 miles back. That is 1,130 miles round trip at the absolute limit of the Zero's range. Pilots who were hit over Guadalcanal could not make it home. They knew this before they took off. On that first day, Nishizawa flew into the massive air battle over the invasion fleet. He shot down 3 American aircraft in a single engagement. His Zero returned to Rabaul without a scratch. Over the next 3 months, as the battle for Guadalcanal raged on the ground and in the air, Nishizawa flew mission after mission over the island. The Americans were learning. Their tactics were improving. New aircraft, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat and later the faster F-4U Corsair, were arriving in numbers Japan could not match. The Zero's advantages were narrowing. But Nishizawa's score kept climbing. 30 victories, 40 victories, 50 victories, each one recorded in the meticulous logs of the Tainan Air Group, each one adding to a reputation that made him a figure of almost mythological status among both Japanese aviators and American intelligence officers who were quietly tracking his career. On that same first day over Guadalcanal, the day of Nishizawa's 3 kills, something happened that shook the Tainan Air Group to its core. Saburo Sakai, flying back toward Rabaul after the engagement, was ambushed by a group of American Avenger torpedo bombers. A burst of machine gun fire struck his cockpit directly. He was hit in the head. He lost the sight in his right eye instantly. Half his body was paralyzed. Saburo Sakai flew 560 miles back to Rabaul, nearly blind, barely conscious, losing blood, by pure instinct and will. He landed the Zero and collapsed. He survived, but his combat flying career was effectively over for nearly 2 years. Nishizawa now flew without his trusted companion. In the diary entries that survive from this period, he writes little about the air battles, but he writes about Sakai constantly, about his absence, about the skies over Guadalcanal feeling emptier. By 1943, the world Hiroyoshi Nishizawa had dominated was disappearing. In the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and over 200 aircraft, and more critically, its irreplaceable core of experienced naval aviators. The pilots who had trained for years, who had accumulated thousands of flight hours, who had made the Zero terrifying, they were gone, killed over Midway, killed over Guadalcanal, killed over Coral Sea. Japan could build more Zeros, it could not build more men like Nishizawa. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning at an extraordinary rate. The Toch Weave, a two-fighter defensive maneuver specifically designed to defeat the Zero's turning advantage, had been introduced in 1942 and was spreading throughout the U.S. Navy. New aircraft were arriving in numbers Japan could not match. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which could take the punishment that Zero gunfire dealt and still fly home, and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which could outrun a Zero in a dive and use energy tactics the lighter Japanese fighter could not counter. And there was something else, something the Japanese command refused to acknowledge until it was far too late. Japan was running out of pilots who knew what they were doing. In 1941, the average Japanese Imperial Navy pilot had between 500 and 700 flight hours before entering combat. By 1944, Japan was sending pilots into battle with fewer than 100 hours. Some had as few as 40.
These young men were not pilots in any meaningful sense. They were passengers in aircraft they barely understood, flying against Americans who had learned from every engagement and were now better trained, better equipped, and better supported than at any point in the war. Nishizawa watched this happen from the cockpit. In the 1943 and 1944 engagements over the Solomon Islands and later the Philippine Sea, he would find himself surrounded by inexperienced wingmen who broke formation at the wrong moment, who panicked under fire, who made the basic errors that got pilots killed. He began to fly more and more alone. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched what was intended to be a decisive carrier battle against the American fleet in the Philippine Sea. It would destroy what remained of Japanese naval air power. In 2 days of fighting, Japan lost 476 aircraft. The Americans lost 123. American pilots, flying in the F-6F Hellcat against Japan's dwindling force of experienced aviators and its mass of undertrained replacements, called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. After the Philippine Sea, Japan had effectively no carrier air power left. The great fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Pacific from Hawaii to India in the first 6 months of the war, it was gone. Nishizawa survived the battle. His score continued to climb, but the war he was fighting now was not a war that could be won. It was a war that could only be delayed. By October 1944, the Americans were landing in the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, was underway. Japan was deploying its final desperate weapon, the kamikaze. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa was still alive, still flying, still somehow surviving. His total confirmed victories now stood at 64. By some Japanese accounts, the actual number was significantly higher, but wartime record-keeping, the chaos of 1944, and the destruction of many Japanese archives in the war's final months make a precise total impossible to verify. What is not disputed is that no other Japanese pilot exceeded his confirmed score. On the morning of October 25th, Nishizawa flew escort for the first wave of kamikaze pilots attacking the American fleet off Leyte. He was providing fighter cover, protecting the suicide pilots from American interceptors long enough for them to reach their targets. It was the job of a surviving veteran, keeping the new men alive just long enough to die.
The mission succeeded. The kamikazes struck the American carrier fleet. Nishizawa returned to Mabalacat Airfield. The next morning, October 26, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa needed to transfer from Mabalacat to Cebu to pick up replacement Zero fighters and ferry them back to the front. He was not flying a Zero, he was a passenger. He climbed aboard a Nakajima C-6N transport aircraft along with several other personnel. The transport was unarmed. It carried no defensive weapons. It could not maneuver. It could not fight. The man who had survived 64 aerial victories, who had dived alone into formations of 8 enemy fighters and returned without a scratch, was now sitting in the back of a slow, unarmed transport plane over the Philippine Sea. At approximately 11 a.m., 2 American Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters from the USS Wasp spotted the transport. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The transport crashed into the sea near the island of Negros. There were no survivors. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa was 24 years old. 1020. Segment 6. Legacy. What Nishizawa Means, 1930 to 2100. B-roll. Modern Japan. Photographs of Nishizawa. His memorial in Matsumoto City. The Pacific Ocean from the air. Japan announced Nishizawa's death in late 1944, and he was posthumously promoted 2 ranks, a rare honor. The Imperial Navy called him the Devil, not as an insult, but as the highest compliment his commanders could imagine, a force of nature, something beyond a normal man. In the post-war years, Saburo Sakai, who survived and lived until 2000, spoke about Nishizawa repeatedly. He said that Nishizawa was the finest pilot he had ever seen, that his abilities were not the product of training alone, but of something that could not be taught. He said that when he learned Nishizawa had been killed in a transport plane, he went silent for a long time before he could speak. It was fitting in a terrible way, Sakai said. He was untouchable in a Zero. He could only die as a passenger. The story of Hiroyoshi Nishizawa is not just the story of a gifted pilot. It is the story of Japan's war in miniature. At the beginning, speed, skill, surprise, and a weapon the enemy did not understand. In the middle, victories that could not be sustained against an enemy that was learning and growing faster than Japan could recover. At the end, not defeat in fair combat, but death in the wrong vehicle at the wrong moment in a war that had already been decided. The Zero was never beaten in a fair fight by a less skilled pilot. Japan was beaten by time, by industry, by the mathematics of production and attrition that no individual, no matter how gifted, could overcome alone. Nishizawa knew this. In the final months, there are accounts of him growing quiet, even by his already quiet standards, flying escort for kamikaze missions, watching the young men go, doing the calculation every veteran must eventually do when the war around them has shifted from something that might be won to something that must be survived. He did not survive it, but 64 times in the most demanding arena in which a human being has ever competed, he was the best there was. 2100. Closing CTA. B-roll. Slow aerial shot of the Pacific. The narrator's voice steady, direct, connecting to the audience. Nishizawa died as a passenger, not a pilot. A man of that skill taken out by the one role he wasn't meant to play. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If you were a commander in 1944 Japan with Nishizawa as your best asset, what would you have done differently? Would you have kept him on the ground, sent him to train the next generation, or would you have done exactly what they did, used him again and again until there was nothing left to use? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to see what happened when the Americans faced a different kind of impossible odds, the next video on this channel will take you inside the cockpit on the other side of this war. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. This has been Worlds and Rights, the battles that built borders,
the moments that made rights.